Hello. I think we'll try to get started in just a moment here. If you're still grabbing coffee, if you want to go back for coffee or sweets, just go ahead and do so. We have a lot of ground to cover. It is. I want to thank you all for being here with us today. A year ago, we had a meeting this week of the Pulitzer Center, and Emmy Pulitzer, our chair, swore that she would never come back to New York this week, but she's here. And I know that many of you had to struggle to get through the UN traffic and everything else in the gridlock here, but thank you. Thank you for making the effort to be here. It's wonderful to see so many friends, journalists, education partners, donors, staff, and board members who've been part of the Pulitzer Center story for going on 2 decades. These are dark, challenging times. We are well into the second year of Europe's bloodiest conflict since World War II. The UN comes together for its most important gathering of the year, and the leaders of China, India, and Russia don't bother to come. And at today's special session on climate, there would be no national speakers from China or the United States, the world's biggest sources of carbon emissions, because the records of those countries are so poor. Public confidence in the credibility of journalism is near record low. But in the face of all that, I hope that you will leave this gathering on a more hopeful note, with the realization that people of good faith across the globe are working to address these challenges and to find solutions together. It is our hope and intent that in the work ahead, the Pulitzer Center can play a significant role. In just a few minutes, we'll be hearing, let me make sure this is working. Hang on. Yeah. In just a few minutes, we'll be hearing about some exciting new initiatives for the center, and from a panel of journalists and other partners about the work that makes the Pulitzer Center so distinctive among journalism and education organizations. But first, just a moment on the new mission statement, vision, and ambition that we're launching today on our website, and that you can preview via the QR codes on the back of the photograph cards at your table. You'll see, if you go there, you'll see on the home page, the mission page, the about page, the staff page, a much better presentation, we think, of our team around the world, of what we're focused on, what our priorities are. The mission itself is this, that the Pulitzer Center champions the power of stories to make complex issues relevant and inspire action. What that means to us is that stories, original, compelling journalism of the highest quality, are at the heart of what we do. Stories on complex issues, from human rights to global health to climate, that journalism done well is uniquely positioned to demystify and untangle. Stories made relevant to the disparate audiences who engage with them around the world. And stories that inspire action by helping readers and viewers see the value in getting engaged as active citizens themselves. We intend to draw on the communities of learning that we are building, what we think of as our network of networks among journalists, academics, educators, and policy activists. We believe that this approach will result in journalism initiatives with more powerful impact and with a strategic focus on reaching the audiences that matter most. Our vision? To become the venue for the world's most innovative and consequential global reporting, with journalism as the key element for mobilizing society through active audience engagement. So much of what we have learned about how to build these networks, these communities of learning, and how to make audience engagement central to everything we do is the result of the support that we have had over the past 5 years. Over the past 5 years from Norway's International Climate and Forest Initiative, NICFI, and from Norad, the Norwegian Agency for Development Cooperation. The Rainforest Journalism Fund, initiated in 2018, has supported projects by hundreds of journalists in more than 50 countries, with a focus on the principal tropical regions of the Amazon, the Congo Basin, and Southeast Asia. 2 years later, 2020, the introduction of our Rainforest Investigations Network gave us the resources to tackle more ambitious cross-border and collaborative investigative projects with year-long fellowships for full-time journalists representing media outlets across the world. It also allowed us to hire expert data and research staff in-house to assist the journalist fellows in their projects, and nearly a dozen education and engagement specialists who are themselves from and based in the rainforest regions. At the beginning of this year, additional Norwegian support allowed us to apply this same model: short-term reporting grants, long-term investigative fellowships, a focus on collaborations, communities of learning, and audience-centered engagement to our work on oceans. So I'm going to pause here just to show a brief video with just a few of the many journalists who have participated in this work thus far. So if we can cue the video.
The Rainforest Journalism Fund project is really important to remind the public about the importance and the significance of our rainforest, especially because it connects the three most important areas: Congo Basin, the Amazon, and Southeast Asia.
Climate change is international, intersectional, and interconnected. All our issues are interconnected.
Who are the main actors in this story? Who is the best person to talk to in this story? Which types of communities haven't been heard? How are you going to try and get them to engage with you? What steps should you take? Really starting that engagement.
Not just the financial support, but also the expertise support, the network support, the training, and the exposure to conferences, that it really gave Makaranga the time, the confidence, the leisure to really go in depth.
Tendo essa continuidade de apoio às iniciativas de jornalistas que estão na Amazônia é fundamental. Focar em jornalistas na Amazônia hoje tem que ser um dos pontos primordiais para se ter, né, pautas específicas e diferenciadas.
The key for me of all of these things is to build networks. I think networks of journalists, networks of ideas, networks of information. The more of these we have, the greater impact journalism can have.
The whole reason I got into journalism was so that I could be in the field and I could talk to different kind of people and I could really explore and engage and dig and, be curious.
Y ella nos decía, ustedes los periodistas nos traen esperanza. Y a mí me chocó un poco eso. Porque en realidad, y se lo dije, para mí es al revés, son ellos que nos traen esperanza a nosotros.
Un article devrait pousser les communautés à être plus conscientes de ce qui se passe autour d'elles et devrait également pousser les décideurs à gérer les populations de façon plus équitable.
It's important to keep on going, keep on reporting, keep the pressure on the government, the powerful, the stakeholders that can preserve and save the forest.
Not yet. Almost. So if you're not familiar with this part of our work, I hope you'll take a look at the rainforest and ocean sections on our website. It's really an astonishing run of breakthrough reporting and productive collaborations, such as those you saw between the New York Times and Intercept Brazil on illegal gold mines in the Amazon, and among NBC News, Indonesia's Tempo, and the Philippines Center for Investigative Journalism on the rampant deforestation caused by the nickel mines serving Tesla's electric car batteries. This communities of learning approach model has also spawned compelling engagement initiatives from new rainforest curricula in Congolese secondary schools working in partnership with the Ministry of Education in Congo and universities in the Amazon to art exhibitions and social media influencer campaigns in Southeast Asia. We believe this model works and that with additional support it can achieve even more. And I'm thrilled to say that our colleagues in Norway agree. We are announcing today a commitment by Norad and NICFI over the next 5 years of 170 million Norwegian kroner, that's $16 million in US dollars, in support of our continued initiatives on rainforest and oceans, but extending now to include work as well on commodity supply chains, financial transparency, and corporate government accountability. And now I am super honored to introduce Espen Barth Eide, Norway's Minister of Climate and the Environment.
Thank you, John. It's lovely to be here. I'm really thrilled about this, and I will, in a second, say a little bit more about this new contribution. But let me first, and by the way, very nice to see Emmy Pulitzer here as well. It was nice to meet you and all friends, all the new friends who are here today at this event. The world is in a dire condition, we know that, and there are so many things to do, as you correctly said. But let me just start with reflecting on a few things that are going well, because there's actually a number of good news in the area we will discuss about here now, particularly, actually both on the global political level and in a number of communities. Over many years now, we've had a recognition that we have a climate crisis as well as a nature or biodiversity crisis and a crisis of pollution. We knew that, we didn't do enough. And to a certain extent, the climate crisis understood that the need to reduce emissions took precedence. It's very important, very good that that had a high appeal, but the other dimensions of the nature crisis had a little bit less. It was a little bit like it was the little sister of the climate crisis, the nature theme. Over the last few years, that has changed quite dramatically. In Glasgow, the climate COP, the climate summit 2 years ago, it was the climate summit with the strongest focus on forests and natural sinks and the role of nature in the fight for climate. And then soon after that, I had the honor of presiding over the United Nations Environmental Assembly. We had a major meeting that started only days after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and flying down there, I thought maybe this meeting would go down the drain, frankly. But we managed to come up with a very solid mandate for negotiating a treaty to end plastic pollution. And Norway and Rwanda are now the co-chairs of the High Ambition Coalition, which has 60 governments involved, and we had a ministerial meeting as late as yesterday here at Ungo, and the official negotiations are undergoing, and we now have a zero draft to a rather remarkable treaty to address the plastic problem at the core. At the same UNEA meeting, we, for the first time, managed to identify the importance of what we call nature-based solutions to the climate crisis, and also to the nature crisis. Not that we didn't know about that scientifically, but it became UN language, as it's called here, and that actually matters. Everybody who deals with difficult countries in the UN, which I do frequently, knows that if something is not UN language, they are very eager to point that out. So putting something into UN language changes that, and that we achieve that as well. And it matters more than you might think. We also agreed to establish a third science policy panel. You all know about IPCC. The International Climate Panel. We also have IPBES on biodiversity, and we are now establishing one on chemicals and waste. So now we will eventually, when this last one is up and running, we'll have sort of a scientific repository of the best insights also on that theme. Move forward a little bit still last year, we ended up in Montreal and signed the Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. Again, we, with many other countries, were in the High Ambition Coalition, and we set some really strong targets for what we wanted to achieve at that UN meeting. Believing, as one typically does when you have high ambitions, that you won't really get there, but you need to put the bar high. So we suggested 30 by 30. Protect and preserve at least 30% of all the world's oceans and all the world's land mass before 2030, and restore or start restoring at least 30% of degraded land and degraded ocean. That was our goal, and actually we achieved that. We achieved that at the UN summit in Montreal, and interestingly, under a Chinese president. Some of us strongly involved in negotiations, and it was quite a success. Still, of course, it's a treaty. It has to be converted into action, but it still means that this is now a consensus expression from the global community that these things matter. A little bit later, and now we're in this year, here in New York, after an accumulated 19 years of difficult negotiations, we signed the BBNJ. That's the Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction. That covers actually literally half of the planet, because 71% of the planet is ocean, and roughly 70% of that ocean, again, is outside the jurisdictional control of any country, outside of economic zones. And if you add these two together, and those of you who are mathematicians or at least study in school will realize that that means half of the planet. So now we also have a biodiversity-related regulatory framework for the deep ocean out there. And as we now prepare for COP28 in Dubai, and I just came here from a meeting preparing that, which was not the Climate Ambitious Summit of the Secretary General, which was a little outside of the normal process, but this was the literal, practical, preparatory meeting for COP28 on what's called the global stocktake. It was surprisingly good. A lot of good ambitions, a lot of recognition of what science tells us, and many, many countries from north, south, east, and west saying we need to listen to science and we need to find better ways of connecting our policies to what science tells us. Let's see, but there is something moving out there. And the reason I spend a little bit of time on this is that these things don't just happen. It's not just that, very wise politicians sit down and it occurs to them that you want to do these things. No, it's not the way it works. It works because there is a rising public attention about these issues. It works because of power of stories. It works because you have investigative journalism, you have NGOs, you have environmental defenders, you have indigenous people, and they are connected to each other and to the world, and their profile is raised, and people start caring, and they start asking us politicians to deal with these issues. So there is a connection here about things that are going well, and the work that many of you in the room have contributed to in one way or the other, because you are involved in this in some form, and some very directly by living out there, being out there, and working with people who feel what's happening on the ground. That's the good news. Then, of course, we also know, and it has to be said, that we are living in a world where we have more and more knowledge, more and more science, more and more facts, but also more and more fact-resistant audiences, where more and more polarization, more and more poisoning of what used to be sort of the free media through deliberate attempts of misinformation, algorithms taking over from editorial boards. So we also have a very serious situation out there. So there's a fight that has to be fought to keep insights into what is true, what is actually happening, and to keep the space for those who report properly, honestly, investigate, go out there and see what's really happening. It's incredibly important. And strong, effective societies get stronger if you have a healthy fourth estate. It's true for the world, it's true for countries, and I think you will see a very solid correlation between independence of media, free media, which are not only technically free, in the sense of absence of restrictions, but also actually able to work, because these are two different things. It's not exactly the same. So we're actually able to work out there. So we are very proud to be a partner with Pulitzer in the work that has already been done. And as has been announced, I'm very happy then to confirm that we now with NICFI, which is in my ministry, the Norwegian International Climate and Forest Initiative, and Norad, which is the Norwegian Agency for Development, have now joined forces to broaden this to almost double the level of support, but also broaden the scope. Of course, continue to work on what we have done on rainforest investigative journalism and all that, but also open it up to other aspects, including oceans, which I mentioned, which is now up on the agenda, governance, and a broader set of themes that are coming in here now. Very happy to do that. We do that because we felt that the first 5 years was very successful. So beginning 1st of January 24, this new round starts, and I hope that it will be really useful and really will help to fight the good fight of getting the real insights of what's happening in the world, because I don't think it matters. I am in these political circles. I do go to all these meetings, and I do notice that people care when they read about these things, when they are pushed by their publics, when they're pushed by their organizations, and you realize that you have to understand some of this. On nature, I'm a nature fan, and I'm quite impressed with what nature does to us. At the end of the day, everything comes from nature, right? What is the economy, after all? Just think about it. Is it sort of derivatives trade at the New York Stock Exchange? Well, it's that too. But why is that possible? It's because we take resources, guess from where? From nature. Or we create food, guess from where? From nature. And we add energy, which we find, again, guess from where? From nature. Either the old energy that nature provided 100 million years ago, which we now burn, or the fresh nature, which are waterfalls or sun or wind and so on that we can tap and use, all from nature. But if we destroy nature, the economy goes away. So it's not only bad for nature, but it's bad for the New York Stock Exchange and everybody related to that or living life on the planet if you undermine a nature that can be preserved. And friends, this modern, highly sufficient technological world that we live in can produce almost everything. It can take us to other planets. It can produce the internet. It can produce medicine. It can within a year or two produce a vaccine against a global pandemic. What we cannot produce is more nature, at least until Elon Musk has found another planet for us, which is still work in progress, and we have to stay on this one. We cannot actually produce more nature. We can only take care of what we have, or we can restore. So restoration is always possible, and just another sweet story, which I'm happy to share. Last week I was at Svalbard, or Spitsbergen, that is that's way north of the continent in Norway, in the Arctic, and there we used to have a coal mine with a rather large company town. Of course, we closed the coal mine years ago because coal mines are things of the past, but we also decided that we want to return the whole area to nature. So not only close the mine, when we took away everything, that's airfield, railroads, roads, colossal amount of buildings, trash, machinery, all gone, apart from a few artifacts which are left for museum purposes, and restored, and it's coming back to nature. And nature has this capacity to come back if you allow it to. So this is also something that I really want to share with you, and it's not only there, but it's one example that these things can happen. So we need to have stories, we need to have people willing to at times take the risk, and that's why it feels so right to use some of the money that we have in Norway to help these people, help us to save the planet and save the people who live on this planet. Thank you for the attention.
Kim and I were in Svalbard a year ago this summer, and we saw how magnificent that part of Norway and the Arctic is. I want to thank you, Minister, for those really profound remarks, and I want to thank as well your colleagues Per Faro, Andreas Dahl-Jorgensen, and Ragnhild Eikenes of Norad and NICFI, who have been such champions of these initiatives all along. I mean, at one point I counted up, I think back in 2018, we had, Ragnhild and I had, I think it was 694 emails back and forth trying to figure out this initiative. And I think we've probably continued something like that trend since. There's been a lot of back and forth and incredibly supportive relationship. I said before that Norway's support has been crucial to the Pulitzer Center's own evolution, with an increasing focus on longer-term and collaborative reporting initiatives, these kind of communities of learning I've described, and the strategic focus from the outset on targeted audience engagement. Thanks to two other significant funders, the Laudes Foundation and the Open Society Foundations, we have also applied, thank you, yes, we've also applied this model to our work on the nexus between climate and labor rights and on AI accountability. I'm pleased to say today that Laudes and OSF are doubling down on their own commitments with multi-year general operating support of $2.4 million from Laudes and $900,000 from OSF. We are incredibly grateful to you both. And glad that Katrin Thomas from Laudes can be here with us today. You know, in our conversations with NORAD, with NICFI, Laudes, OSF, and others, one frequent topic is our own sustainability. How does the Pulitzer Center, as a nonprofit, ensure its own survival and continued value to the many communities we serve? You know, one answer is that we have to demonstrate that value every day, as we have tried to do through 17 years of thus far unbroken growth. Another crucial part of the answer is our determination at the staff and board of directors level to give the Pulitzer Center the financial resources and stability it must have if we are to be that engine of innovation we envision. Beginning with the establishment of a reserve fund more than a decade ago, we have endeavored to raise not just operating revenue, but also the endowment gifts that ensure income in perpetuity to sustain our work. We have today, as a result, what I believe is the largest endowment of any nonprofit journalism organization that has emerged in the last 2 decades. That endowment, I'm happy to say, will soon be larger still. Emily Rauh Pulitzer, our chair, in the hope of encouraging the sort of long-term support we need, agreed to match up to $10 million any multi-year support that we raise during 2023. With these commitments from Norway, from Laudes, and OSF, we have met that challenge. Emmy has chaired our organization since its creation in 2006, tirelessly working to leverage her own contributions so as to bring in additional support and to make the Pulitzer Center the permanent resource we both intend it to be. We've done this in tandem with our magnificent board of directors, a number of whom are with us today. And I'd like for you all to stand, beginning, Emmy, with you. And Dick Moore, Bill Bush, Sam Dolnick, Azmat Khan, Joel Motley, and David Rowe. You know, they and the board members who could not be with us today are about as amazing collection of human beings you could hope to do something as important as what we tried to do. And we sometimes disagree about some things, but we've had remarkable unity about what the mission of the Pulitzer Center is and how it has evolved over time. I would also ask if the Pulitzer staff members present could also stand. I am so grateful to you, to our colleagues. Most of the people who are working at the Pulitzer Center on rainforest and oceans issues are actually in Sweden this week at the Global Investigative Journalism Network, doing, I think it's 3 or 4 different panels on various aspects of our work made possible by this support. So Marina Walker-Guevara, our executive editor, Gustavo Faleros, our senior environmental editor, our Jessica Alder, our oceans editor, they're all there, sharing news about what we're doing with that largest group of investigative journalists in the world. So this story is being told in Sweden this week as well. I also want to acknowledge the nearly 60 Pulitzer colleagues across the globe, the 2,000 plus journalist grantees who and education partners with whom we've had the privilege to work, and to my wife, Kim, our Reporting Fellows Director, who I do want to say has been my most steadfast and wisest partner throughout. So, thank you. I salute you all. So, after that rather extensive introduction, I know that Minister Eide and several of his colleagues, I think, have got to go back to the United Nations. So we thank you again. We'll pause just a moment as they depart, and if our panelists had come to the front, I think we're all mic'd up, then we'll start to sharing some of the actual journalism and community engagement that we've just been describing. Thank you. I'm looking forward to this, very much looking forward to this part of the presentation, because I know these 4 presenters are so fabulous, but also so you can hear somebody else besides me talk. I want to start with Jake Silverstein, the editor-in-chief of the New York Times Magazine. And one reason is because we've done so many collaborations, usually at Jake's suggestion, and always brilliant, creative ideas that, like with Norway, that has taken the Pulitzer Center places we never thought we'd go, and built our capacity in ways that we hadn't imagined. But also because in terms of climate, if you go back 5 years, this summer, we did a big project with the New York Times on climate with Nathaniel Rich and George Steinmetz, the photographer. And when we announced the first Norway grant at the Global Climate Summit in San Francisco back in September 2018, we took George and Nat Rich with us to do presentations at sort of side events on that. And then we did a lot of activity in our network of schools and universities to try to get as much mileage and impact out of that project as we could. So I think we'll start with we're going to show you just like the 10, 20-second interactive intro to that project. It was an entire issue of the magazine, fantastic photography, so you'll get a sense of what that's like. And then Jake, if you can just sort of talk about that kind of project and the approach that the magazine has taken to this kind of work.
think that's where the intro that you wanted to show stops. So first of all, before I say anything else, just John, thank you so much for having me and all of us here. But most of all, thank you for your support and your partnership and your creative inspiration and journalistic wisdom over the years. It's, as you said, it's truly remarkable how many projects the New York Times and the New York Times Magazine has benefited from a partnership with the Pulitzer Center on. I actually don't even know the number, it's so high. But it's really been I've been the editor of the magazine for about 9.5 years now, and the relationship with Pulitzer has really defined a lot of our most ambitious work, certainly in the international context and even in the domestic context over the past decade. So really, truly, I appreciate it, and congrats on all the wonderful news today. This project is a good example of the kind of thing I was just talking about, the ambitious work that this partnership between the New York Times and Pulitzer has enabled. This project was briefly, this was a story by Nathaniel Rich, who is a writer for the magazine, who often writes about climate change. And Nat wanted to write a historical piece. Often people who, like Nat, who cover climate, in story after story after story, like I'm sure a lot of people in the room, come up against the sort of interesting problem of covering climate, which is that the new story is always kind of erasing the story of a previous few years, or at least in terms of engaging the public, there's a sense that the story is always, the new story of this year or of the most recent forecast, et cetera, is always moving you forward in a way that makes it a little hard to remember where you've been. And Nat wanted to write a story that was essentially a work of climate history, helping readers understand the origins of our modern. Did my mic just go out? No? Okay. The origins of our modern understanding of our climate crisis and of efforts to stop it. And Nat pinpointed the decade that lasts from 1979 to 1989 as the crucial decade in which a consensus emerged, a scientific consensus emerged about the problem and what was causing it. The possibility of a political and a governmental consensus over what needed to happen in terms of international cooperation to stop the process. And then, of course, as we all know, the failure of that to culminate in the kinds of measures that would be required. And the story, Nat is a really gifted storyteller. And so he's able to take you into the rooms where you're seeing, in this very, I have to say, heartbreaking way, you're seeing conversations between scientists, between activists, between people in government, between industry leaders who are debating at a moment when they, of course, didn't understand what was going to happen. They had a sense of it, but they couldn't know the way we do. They're debating, things like how to word a certain statement about the kind of where the science is at that moment in, say, the early 80s. And you're really in the room, you're understanding in a sort of narrative history type of way how the understanding of the climate crisis emerged during the decade of 1979 to 1989. Part of what seemed to us to be that it would be so meaningful to a contemporary reader, this was published in 2018, to a contemporary reader about this project was that, of course, we're reading it in 2018. We're reading it in the present. We're reading it in the present that has been created by the failures of the people in Nat's story to act in the 1980s. And we wanted to represent that visually. You got a little bit of a sense of it from the pictures, from the pictures that are cycling right now, but also from the introduction that was up on the screen, that video introduction. We wanted readers to have a sense, as they're reading about the twists and turns of the various negotiations in the 1980s that Nat is writing about, we wanted them to be continually confronted as they moved through that history with images of the present, with images of the climate crisis as it looked in 2018 from all over the world. And we wanted to be on every continent. We wanted to be as extensive as we could be in that visualization. I should say that Nat's reporting and writing and research for the text that went with these pictures, right, unfolded over more than a year and involved, interviews with more than 100 individuals. Not the kind of thing that
for an average story in the magazine, and this was by no means an average story, it filled, as John said in his introduction, the entirety of one issue of the magazine. It's not the sort of thing that we have the time or the resources to do every time out. So the support from the Pulitzer for Nat was really important. It was also crucially important when we had the notion that we would couple it, this work that Nat was doing, with this visualization of the climate crisis across the whole world. We hired this photographer, George Steinmetz, who specializes particularly in aerial photography. We had the idea creatively that we wanted readers to have the visual experience as they're reading this kind of fine-grained, close-to-the-ground narrative history of the 1980s, that they're sort of floating above the earth as it looks today, where we can visually see the effects of the inaction that's being documented in that story, kind of punctuating that story as you read through it. And that idea is one of, again, I can't quite even remember how many that I've gone to John and said, what if we ... You know, and John has often not only found a way to support that, but found a way to kind of fan the flames of those ambitions. And I should say, this is maybe a good segue to say that that project, the one we're talking about, this Losing Earth story by Nat Rich, part of what was obviously ambitious about it was that, as we've now mentioned a couple of times, it took over the entire issue of the magazine. The inspiration for that was a project from 2 years earlier that was also would not have been possible without a support from the Pulitzer Center, which was a landmark project in the New York Times Magazine called Fractured Lands. This was a story, over 40,000 words, that told the just incredible narrative of the collapse of the Middle East in that era, in that moment, accompanied by photographs that documented not just the previous year, but the previous 20 years by Paolo Pellegrin. We are lucky enough to have the brilliant author of that piece in the house today, Mr. Scott Anderson in the back there. And that, you know, that was one of the first big projects that we worked on together. 2016, is that right, Scott? Yes. 2016. It was one of the first big projects that we worked on, and it was a real eye-opener for us, in that not only was the support for the project, and again, not just the financial support for the project, which was absolutely necessary, but the journalistic support for the project as well. Not only was that crucial to making it what it was, but then the fact that it was then turned into a curriculum afterward was also a real eye-opener for us in the way that it extended the reach of the journalism, it engaged people after the fact. I mean, just seeing, you know, when you're an editor and you work with a writer like Scott and then you finish the story and see it published, and then for months and months and months afterwards, you're getting notes from Scott, who's traveling the whole country and speaking to students who are still reading the story and still engaging with it, is just incredible. So the educational outreach that Pulitzer has provided for those two stories, as well as countless others that we've done, has changed the way we think about the impact that our journalism can have in the world. Anyway, to just wrap up real quickly, it was partly because of the inspiration that we all took from the work of the work that Scott worked on, Fractured Lands, taking over the whole issue of the magazine, giving readers who were not really, you know, expecting to find essentially a short book in their Sunday New York Times, something of that scale and depth and profundity. That really opened our eyes. We tried it again a couple years later with this Losing Earth project. And you know, it was one of the really, truly most memorable things that we've done in the past decade. So neither of those things, as well as many others, would have been possible without this partnership, for which we're very, very grateful.
Jake is talking about these projects that sort of run away with themselves. We had another one that you may remember called the 1619 Project that led to a lot of activity. But two asides on Fractured Lands. It's great that Scott is here. The reason that partnership came about, the reason that I met Jake in the first place, because I was at Columbia, what they used to call the Sulzberger Mid-Career Program for Journalists, and Sam Dolnick, who had to leave early, but one of our board members at the New York Times, Sam and I were in that class together, and this is based on sort of a challenge you take on, every person who comes. And what I was trying to do was to set up our engagement program. At that point, more focused on the United States, much less than what we're doing now globally. but I was working on that this year, and so Sam was hearing me over the course of weeks and months talking about this idea. And then at some point he said, well, Jake is thinking about this really interesting project. You guys should talk about fractured lands. And that led to meeting with Scott and the decision to go forward with that project. And then the other thing that I remember about that, Scott, you probably remember going to Chicago. We went out to Chicago together to Whitney Young High School, Magnet High School, Michelle Obama's alma mater. And we got there, and not only the high school, like the 10th, 11th graders, they've been working on this project all year. They had a huge timeline in the hallways of the school. It was literally about 50 feet long that was showing all of the milestone years over the last 20 years in the Middle East, and then combining that with when was Destiny's Child created, when did it break up, when did Beyonce, all these pop cultural things that were happening in the course of their lifetime, they were relating it to what was going on. And then the teacher, our partner there, who was a genius teacher, and she had the idea of having the students develop and write, illustrate books for younger readers that would take one of the characters in Fractured Lands, because Scott you were following 10, 12 characters across the Middle East. And so they took out each of these narratives and they wrote them, and then they took them in to middle school. So you had the New York Times transmitted to an inner city high school in Chicago, translated into material that was suitable for a 10 or 11-year-old. And that's what we mean by engagement and sort of taking these stories out. So I want to turn next to Azmat Khan, actually another somewhat ambitious New York Times project. She was involved in. Azmat, of course, as you've heard, is a member of our board. She directs the Lee Center on Global Reporting at Columbia University. And that's Columbia is one of the schools that, the 40 or so schools that Kim and Ann Peters and Michaela and Libby work with in our campus consortium, reporting fellowships for students and lots of events that take place on campus. So Azmat is really important to us as somebody who is both an extraordinary journalist who's the project on the civilian casualties and the failure of the U.S. government to acknowledge or to respond to the level, the people who were killed as collateral damage in the wars in the Middle East and Afghanistan. Extraordinary, won the Pulitzer Prize last year. But it's also something that involved the work of students, which we think is a really important part of our mission. So, Azmat.
Thank you so much, John. I really appreciate that lovely introduction, and it's such an honor to be here with so many journalists and editors and others whom I admire. I want to tell you a little bit about what became a 6-year-long project, ultimately known as the Civilian Casualty Files, but a little bit about where years of work like that started and where this ecosystem that we've been talking about today, where that ecosystem played an essential role in making that kind of work happen. That big, in-depth, sustained reporting that you heard being talked about by journalists in the Rainforests video, or some of our other panelists here today. But this work began for me in 2016 with a single question. Amidst the US-led war against ISIS and these tens of thousands of airstrikes that we have been targeting, how many civilians are actually dying? Because at that time, the US military was claiming in April of 2016 to have killed 21 civilians and killed as many as 25,000 ISIS fighters. And if you know anything about war, you know that those numbers simply are not possible. But the only way to truly understand or to get at a better understanding of what's really happening and what the human costs of our wars are is to be on the ground at a time when it's dangerous to do that in Iraq and Syria, at a time when funding freelance journalism, and I was a freelancer, is incredibly difficult. And I started with that question, and I set out to do a sample. And over a 2-year-long period, I was able to publish a story in the New York Times Magazine. It found a home with arguably a place that, without which this never would have existed. I can guarantee you that. But we published a New York Times Magazine story in late 2017 called The Uncounted. And that was based on a sample of 103 airstrikes in northern Iraq, in which I went door to door, interviewing survivors, collecting evidence, digging through rubble, pulling up satellite imagery, going to the US-led coalition, to their airbase in Qatar, getting an embed as a freelancer, investigating every single one of those 103 airstrikes and turning those numbers over to the coalition, and ultimately learning that 1 in 5 of those airstrikes was resulting in a civilian death. And if you analyzed the government's data at the time, which I had built a database of their own press releases and what they claimed, according to their data, 1 in 157 airstrikes was resulting in a civilian death. That's not 3 times higher, 4 times higher, 5 times higher. What I was finding was not just, it was 31 times higher than what the American public was being told. And so that work was essential, it was important, and so many times you would have run into editors who say, okay, that's it, you've spent 2 years, you had a story that spurred impact, but it's time to move on. And I was so lucky that this infrastructure had started to develop especially after this project came out, and especially because of the New York Times Magazine's investment. And I'm also, as John mentioned, I'm an assistant professor at Columbia, where I lead the Lee Center for Global Reporting. I've been teaching conflict reporting there since 2019. And I began hiring some of my students and also some of my former students from that conflict reporting course to get involved in this database work. With additional funding and support, I was able to, in Iraq, actually in Mosul, hire students at the University of Mosul to work with me and train. And throughout all of that, we built a curriculum. And I wound up suing the Department of Defense. I have multiple lawsuits against them, but ultimately sort of obtaining, because it's one thing to say this is how many civilians are dying, but it's much harder to understand why. Why are those happening? You really need the intelligence. You need what we're told is off limits for national security reasons. And so, I sued to get more than 1,300 of these so-called assessments that are done, investigating every allegation of civilian casualties. This model, apparently, for accountability and transparency. And these documents were just rolling in. I had students working with me in digitizing them, and ultimately later studying them with me. I worked with students at the University of Mosul in the field who learned incredible new geospatial imagery analysis techniques, learned about sensitive interviewing and being on the ground, and I learned a great deal from them about the place where they were born and raised. And it's that kind of ecosystem that if we go forward, can produce work that is 5 or 6 years long and tells the stories. These are beautiful photos taken by Ivor Prickett, this extraordinary New York Times. He was taking these photos for the New York Times Magazine, and I'm not going to talk about each of these individual people. You can read about it. And also, I don't want to cry today. I'm having such a good day. But it really laid bare, how often what was going wrong was a problem of intelligence, was misidentifying targets. And we were able to really track in numbers why these deaths were happening and whether or not the US military was taking any of that into account. And what it revealed was a system of what we described in the New York Times and the New York Times Magazine as a system of impunity. And so you can read some of these stories, and if we just go forward, the Simon and June Lee Center for Global Journalism, which I lead, really takes a lot of these concepts. It's not just, here's my individual projects, this is what I'm doing. It's cultivating a lot of those young journalists who are training, bringing them into other projects. And we also have a great partnership with the Pulitzer Center, in which it's part of its campus consortium, and a number of journalism students every year graduate with these incredible early investments in their work so they can do projects like this. So I'm currently overseeing some of those fellows and working with the Pulitzer Center to do more of this. If we just go one more forward, I do also just want to highlight that it's not just about being on the ground, it's also about the changing ecosystem and technologies that we have access to and the great journalism that can be done from it. And so, one of the projects that Jake was incredible at shepherding, it wasn't just a magazine piece, it was across every part of the Times, including the New York Times' extraordinary visual investigations team. And so one of my former students, Laila Hassan, also worked with the visual investigations team. And then at Columbia, we've been really trying to bring some of these open source intelligence tools, or OSINT tools, things like spatial imagery analysis, different kinds of mapping and identifying things based on open source information. We're really trying to integrate those tools, but also to do so with an ethical lens, right? To think about the challenges they present when you remove people from the ground. And so, I say all of this to essentially say that these networks are so linked, and that journalism, like my own, or even just some of the journalists that come through the school and go on to do extraordinary work, it wouldn't be possible without this ecosystem. And I'm looking out at the room and seeing so many extraordinary freelancers, Nadia Drost in particular, who's maybe my favorite journalist. It's just, we're so lucky to be able to tap into this. So I'm grateful to be here, and grateful to all of you who've been supportive.
Great. Azmat, I'm really glad you brought up the part about the Times data and the visual investigations team, because part of it, the idea of the communities of learning that I was talking about, the sort of network of networks, and how we can leverage the people we know and the work that we're doing, and some of what we tried to do with the center is to make those connections. I don't think Nadia and Bruno had done any video they certainly hadn't done it for PBS NewsHour. I think we helped to make a connection there. And then that turned into a really important part of your career, and including the amazing work on the Darien Gap, the migrants crossing through that passage. I want to turn next to the non-journalist on this panel, Richard Mosse, the photographer. And I think I'm right. It was around like 2011 or so that I first heard the name Richard Mosse from our daughter Eide, who's here. And Eide at the time was working for Human Rights Watch and GOMA, and she was checking in with us, as she occasionally did, and saying that this fellow had shown up and was in the group house where she was living, and that he was really interested in learning about Eastern Congo. Didn't know much about it. But he had this idea about doing something different with photography to try to bring attention to it. And then we kept hearing about it. And then after a while, we saw some of the photographs, and we said, "Whoa, we want to be part of that." So and Richard has gone on. The other reason that I wanted to have him here today is because he's more recently has just done another extraordinary project on Amazon burning, and that was featured in the New York Times a few weeks ago. It's been out in San Francisco on an exhibit. I think it's moving elsewhere. But Richard, if you can tell us about your approach and your role in sort of the journalism world.
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much, John. Hi, Eide. Fond memories from Eastern Congo, and Kem, good to see you again. I showed up in Congo in 2010, and I became friends with Eide, who works for Human Rights Watch. And I was very green, I was a photographer who was an artist who was frustrated with reportage photography, with its failure in Eastern Congo. And so the International Rescue Committee had speculated or projected that 5.4 million people had lost their lives to war-related causes in Eastern Congo alone in the 10 years between 1998 and 2008. So, the scale of this is almost, hard to imagine. And yet the genocide in Darfur, which was happening around that time, far lower casualty rate, was generating 10 times the amount of column inches in the newspapers and internationally. So there was a failure of reportage, there was a failure of storytelling, a failure of the media, and a failure of seeing, after all. And I think that goes back to this sort of saturation of an image, as I'm speaking as a photographer here. When you see an image so many times, it sort of starts to fail. And that point of failure was very interesting to me as an artist to work with. And I wanted to subvert that, to deconstruct it for myself, and to find a new way to refresh those stories as narratives. And so I took this idea of the invisible quality narrative that I was looking at, the unseen, the hidden. And I asked myself quite simply, well, how can I see the unseen? And photography does have a way of doing that. it's a type of infrared photography actually invented by the US military in World War II to detect camouflage. So I said, well, this is very interesting because it also unpacks aspects of my subjectivity as a Westerner going to Africa. And of course, the global systems at play in Eastern Congo are to do with rare earth mineral extraction, to do with international, globalized trade. So I began to use this medium as a way to investigate this subject and to unpack this idea of this failure of reportage and a failure of seeing. And what began as a philosophical, personal question for myself, very, low level, over time, weirdly, it started to have this mass media effect on. I was seeing my pictures being, reprinted and all over on magazines and papers and front covers. And I did a little book initially in 2011. It was assisted by the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting. They helped me publish it, and that was co-published with Aperture. And the print run was only 1,500 editions. But then this sort of exponential wave of press interest and genuine human interest and the work began to have strange, weirdly, an element of advocacy for some of the narratives. And I spent 5 years working in Eastern Congo, and I'd met more than 8 or 10, living amongst 8 or 10 armed groups. And so I really began to have, over time, you become committed to a place, and you begin to have a depth of knowledge and understanding. And I never call myself an expert, though, because in any case, I brought those. I suppose that's always been a central part of my practice, is this to investigate problems of seeing. And in Brazil in 2019, I begun working in Ecuador in 2018, and Bolsonaro was elected in 2019. And that summer was an exponentially long dry season, or what they call burn season in the Amazon. That's your season for burning. Now, they would burn all the time if they could. But they can't because of the rain. And that year, there was about 4 months of dry season, so they burnt like hell because Bolsonaro was encouraging this. And so I went down there to northern Brazil, to the Amazon, and I started to look at what I was to absorb the information from the field. And again, I was frustrated with this exhausted image of a burning rainforest. You've seen one, you've seen them all, and it didn't unpack the complexity of the systems at play, and just the texture of all of the fronts of deforestation that I was observing on the ground and photographing. And so I looked at the ways in which scientists were looking at these, because it's very complex what's happening there on an ecological basis as well. And they use GIS mapping, geographic information systems. Remote sensing satellites in space have special cameras called multispectral cameras that see from above, that map the Earth and have been doing for decades, and see the Earth in a very specific way across different bands of the electromagnetic spectrum. And this, I became super interested in this when I realized that it was also being used, the same technology, by the multinational mining companies, by agribusiness interests, by the bad guys. So the photographic medium that I was excited by had an agency itself. It was somehow complicit in the narratives I was trying to describe, more adequately convey. So I thought, well, wow, that is, within the image itself, we were able to encode many of these systems to foreground some of these invisible things within the picture frame. And that got me excited, as well as the frankly, aesthetic quality of the resulting imagery, this false color palette that is the imagery that scientists produce to reveal things in the forest. And by the way, I just want to say, in closing, they've used this GIS data they've been harvesting for decades, since the 70s. Recent reports in the last few years have used all that data over the Amazon to understand that 75% of the entire rainforest, this is the largest tropical rainforest in the world that spans 9 countries, is so degraded by the processes of deforestation that I was observing that it's at a tipping point now very soon, and some say 10 years, some say less. Others say there are many different tipping points that will result in one larger one. In any case, there's a point at which the rainforest stops generating its own rain. And when that happens, it's no longer rainforest, it dies back. It's a process of mass forest dieback, automatic death of the entire biome. And with that comes a massive release of carbon stored all across this enormous rainforest. And we can't see that with our eyes. We can't see that 75% of damage. But this type of imaging that the scientists were using, and which also the multinational mining companies and the agribusiness were using, can. So I wanted to use that indexically, metaphorically, and aesthetically to try to overlap the three sort of powers or faculties, or potentialities of the medium, and to make this story, to refresh it and to tell it anew. So I'll stop there, and thank you, John.
Thank you, Richard. Just a quick aside about the Infra project on Congo and the Aperture photography book. There was some discussion, as I recall, I think on our board as well, about how exactly was this a journalism project? And when the book came out, we agreed that we would co-fund it with Aperture, and it came out. We had an event at the Aperture Foundation, and Richard spoke, shared the work. Susan Meiselas, who was the founder of Magnum Photography, great photographer, she was there, and she just went right at us and said, "What? This is not journalism. It's a manipulated image, and you can't deny that it is a manipulated image." But we were saying that we were done that on purpose to try to bring attention to something that people were looking right past, as Richard is suggesting. And as we saw with, I think at last count, I think in that first year, it was something like 40 different publications around the world ran the story. Richard got picked to go to the Venice Biennale for Ireland, and it got more coverage there. It got an enormous amount of coverage, and he also got Adam Hochschild to do the introduction to that book. And Adam Hochschild, who'd written King Leopold's Ghost, taught at Berkeley, was an expert on Congo, and so he did bring that element into the reporting. But the draw for people buying the book and following the project was the infrared photography and the way that Richard did it. So congratulations, it was good. And I think he's had somewhat the same kind of effect with the way he's gone about the Amazon work. And speaking of the Amazon, now I want to turn to Aranha, the Special Projects Editor, Repórter Brasil. Repórter Brasil is a great nonprofit investigative news organization in Brazil. I met Ana, her colleagues, back in 2019. I was introduced by Gustavo Fileros, who was a former grantee, sort of these communities of learning and the interlocking networks that I keep coming back to. Gustavo had been a grantee of ours. He did a great project. And then when I went down to São Paulo, I was trying to make contact with various news outlets, hoping that we would find other kindred spirits that we could do work with together. And Repórter Brasil was one of the places we went. And over the years since, we've done several projects, really significant projects with them. A year ago, in June, Dom Phillips, one of the people I met on that trip, who was a special correspondent for The Guardian, was in the Javari Valley and up near the border of Colombia in Brazil, along with Bruno Pereira, an indigenous expert activist. And the two of them were murdered. And we, at the time, we did a special emergency call of course, this was still during the administration of Bolsonaro, who didn't have much interest in pursuing justice in that case or any other case concerning the Amazon. So we put out a special call. We did several projects. I think probably the most significant was the documentary that Ana and her colleague Daniel Camargos did that's now in festival screening. I think that, let's turn it to Ana to tell us more about that project.
Thank you, John. Thank you so much, everyone. It's an honor to be here among such brilliant colleagues and such creative projects. And Richard, congratulations for the idea of colors I keep using these tools to track deforestation, and they are always pink. And it does work, communicates. But before I start talking about our work in Repórter Brasil and the documentary, I would like to ask for a few moments to honor our friend, our colleague, Dom Phillips, who, like John said, was killed while covering the Amazon. Dom was researching for a book called How to Save the Amazon, and that's when he was killed So since we are gathering here today to talk about the importance of journalism, I would like to ask for a round of applause to honor his memory. Thank you. Dom was a brilliant reporter. Like John said, he was a freelancer for The Guardian at the time. He was also a very generous friend. He was always worried about our safety, about the others who were, going to the Amazon. By the time it all went down, he was with Bruno Pereira, respected indigenous in Brazil. Bruno saw in Dom an ally for his work, for his struggle. But this alliance ended with so much brutality. I'm going to give you some horrific details, but I feel that I have to so that you understand what's going on in the Amazon. They were killed by a fisherman who Dom was investigating, a man involved with illegal fishing in the Amazon. And after they were shot, their bodies were cut in pieces, burned, and then hidden in the Amazon forest. That's the kind of brutality that's knocking at our door. It's our nightmare. It's what we are dealing with when covering the Amazon, when we go on the ground. I don't live in the Amazon. I live in Brasilia. I'm safe at my house. But whenever we are going to these places, that's what we are facing. And I think this resonates with other journalists, of course, who are in the frontiers of climate change, and also other journalists who are covering this topic. Because I think all of us, as are working, are feeling some level of fear while we work, at least the ones who are taking seriously, who are taking climate change seriously. So when it all happened, we were, of course, devastated. We were in fear. Dom was our colleague. We didn't know what to do. Some of us didn't think that we should cover the case because we didn't have enough distance. We were too much attached to the story. And we thought that this was a moment to actually reflect on where journalism stands nowadays. How can we keep on going? How can we keep on going to these areas and covering this issue that we know that is so important under such threat? And that's when the Pulitzer Center came in and helped us to be there within 2 days or 3 days after Dom's disappearance. We were there, we were in the field. And we decided to do a documentary because Repórter Brasil has a journalistic branch that's more like our mind branch, and documentary branch that's more like our heart and emotion arm. So we decided to do a documentary because then we could reflect on our dilemmas. We could talk about what we were going through as journalists and how we would face this awful coverage, the coverage of a friend who had disappeared and we still didn't know who was alive or not. So that's what we did. We did a reflexive documentary, but also direct cinema because we follow Daniel Camargos. Daniel Camargos is a reporter, one of our staff members, and he was the one closest to Dom because they had actually been traveling around the Amazon during joint investigations Repórter Brasil has done for some time with The Guardian. So a few of these joint investigations were done by Dom Phillips and Daniel Camargos in the Amazon. So they became friends, of course, traveling for such long periods. And then Daniel was the one who wanted to go, who wanted to be there and wanted to look for his colleague's body. This was especially hard for him, of course, but I think we managed to construct a documentary that is respectful to both Dom's memory and Daniel's feelings at that time. So we are, one of the issues that we raise in the film is, of course, safety. How do we, and one of the questions we were asking ourselves back then was, should we keep on covering the Amazon on the ground? should we stop altogether? I mean, are we in a suicide mission? We don't want to die. We want to do our work, of course, but not at the expense of our life. So how? By then, it didn't seem very, possible to think rationally. So we were asking ourselves that question. And that's what drives the beginning of the film. That's how we went to the Amazon, and that's how we were looking at this terrible incident. So after Danielle comes back from the coverage, and they did find the bodies, there was a significant police force that was put together because Dom was a journalist and because he was an international journalist. So this case got a lot of attention, very different from all the other hundreds of cases that we cover in the Amazon of environmental defenders that are killed every month in Brazil and have very little attention. But in Dom's case, they found their bodies. They are prosecuting the people who killed them. And after this coverage, Danielle moved on, and documentary moves on with him to other issues, other pressing issues in the Amazon, still, reflecting on our role, how we stand after losing a friend. And then Danielle moves on to a coverage of a gathering. It was an indigenous gathering, like an exchange program, that had been planned by Bruno Pereira, the indigenous who was with Dom, who was killed with Dom. So we thought it's a way to, keep on covering Bruno's work and Dom's work while they're not here, but we will keep on doing their work. So we went to cover this gathering, and it was really dangerous because indigenous were they are defending their own land, literally fighting for it. So they carry guns. They are often confronted by the invaders, by the loggers, by the miners, and they have to defend themselves with guns. So we had to go with them. Of course, we didn't have guns, but we did think about wearing bulletproof vests, having bulletproof vests for our team. But that wouldn't be feasible, to walk in the Amazon, to keep the pace in the tracks of the Amazon wearing it. It's just not possible. So they went, it all went well, but we became a little bit paranoid with security protocols because we had to. So this is another thing that we discuss in this documentary, is how do you understand what's rational, what's emotional, what fear is important to be heard, what fear is important to be faced if you are equipped to face a risky reality. Because if you decide you don't want to take any risks, then you stay at home. You don't go to cover the Amazon. That's the safety, the safest choice, no doubt. But if you are going to take risks, so you need to take risk assessments. And we went through this whole bureaucratic program of security protocols that is really boring. I'm sure all of you have been through this. It makes our life a lot less fun when traveling around the Amazon. But yeah, so we went through all that, and then now we are safer, I think. And also thanks to all the funders that we have that are very understanding about this, about the expenditures, the time that we spend, and the amount of money spent in this. It's really important. So by the time we were discussing the security measures, one of the things that was really impactful for our performance, not only our joy, was that we had to make the decision to stop listening to the other side on the ground. This is something that is really important for Repórter Brasil, and we know that it was really important to Dom Phillips as well. When we are investigating a group, we try as much as we can to reach the group we're investigating. So we try to look at people in the eye. We try to really understand their reasons, their arguments, to contemplate this in our story. So we used to do this on the ground, but then we had to stop. Of course, we still hear the other side, but after the reporters come back, they'll do this by phone or by email. But just to be clear, this didn't start because of Dom. It started a few months before when one of our reporters, Danielle too, was investigating a British mining company, a multinational that's been mining in Brazil. He knocked at their door, at their mining site, and requested an interview. He was welcomed inside, he was offered coffee and told to wait so that he could get his interview. Instead, 1 hour later, the police arrived, armed with heavy guns, saying that they needed to seize their equipment, they needed to erase their footage. So Danielle was prepared for the situation. He knew how to reply, he knew who to call, and we managed to get him out of there. He had to go to the police department. It was a whole day of stress, but he managed to get out. He didn't lose any of his footage, and the mining company actually shut that site down, so it was a happy ending. But since then, we don't allow reporters to try to reach the other side on the ground, which we think is terrible, and we are eager to be able to return, to be able to talk to all sides. We think this is part of good journalism. We think this is bad for our journalism. We also think it's part of a civilized world, but we have to wait until the other side wants to be heard, right? They are not threatening us, so we have to wait. Dom was killed because he was listening to the other side. He and Bruno had been traveling around the Javari Valley into dangerous places, and then they were just getting back home. They were almost reaching the city when they decided to make a quick stop to try to listen to this fisherman who was accused. He said he wasn't there, and then he followed them and killed them right there, right after the attempt of interview. So after this happened, I think at least in the Javari Valley, things were less dangerous, but now it's all back, So when we go to the Amazon, we have to be always very, very careful. So to wrap up, we did a final field trip for this documentary because we wanted to show different realities of the Amazon coverage. And we did one that I think speaks even louder to the heart, which was a case of water contamination by mining, illegal mining inside indigenous lands, where the Munduruku people, indigenous group, is being intoxicated by mercury. So Danielle went to interview the families that had babies with severe development problems. So these babies at first couldn't keep their head straight. They were like tilting down like this. Later on, they couldn't talk, they couldn't walk. And I think that's one of the pictures we show of a baby that twisting his fingers like this is one of the symptoms as well. So scientists in Brazil are studying this, and it's called the Minamata disease, after a huge case of mercury contamination in the city of Minamata in Japan a few decades ago. So we come back from this trip thinking, these are really terrifying stories. I mean, killing a journalist and defenders is one thing. Now, just doing this with children, with newborn, it's another level of horror, right? So how do we... And I think that this resonates with everyone who's covering climate change. How do we cover such a horrific topic? I mean, how do you deal with the stress? And we believe that covering the indigenous, not only the indigenous, but also the landless workers, the traditional populations in Brazil, we really take inspiration because when we are with them, it's very clear that they are fighting their fight because they are fighting for their life. So land and life for them is 100% associated. For us, it's more dissociated, right? We are now rationalizing that climate change will affect our future, our children and everything. We might get, serious trouble in our life, but for them it's direct. And when they choose to keep fighting, although they are risking their life, they are choosing life. So it's the same thing, they are choosing life. So this is how we manage to really end this mourning cycle, Dom's mourning cycle, with this choice. We are going to continue the work, covering the Amazon on the ground. We choose to do this, but we are doing this under a lot of security and a lot of care because we are not on a suicide mission, right? We don't want to become martyrs. We want to live. We are choosing life after all. And I think this, during the Climate Week, I've been finding that this resonates among other colleagues that are also covering this theme. And, I'm sure you all agree there's more than time that we take a stand on the issue. We choose a side, let's say. We choose a side and do it responsibly. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. So you raised so many important points about journalism. I want to save at least a few minutes to see if there are any questions that you all have while you have these folks in front of you. But before we do that, maybe just a very quick round. I'm curious to get the thoughts of the others about what Anna's just been talking about. But when are you in situations that basically you are choosing sides? When is that appropriate for a journalist? When do you make decisions, well, I'm not going to get, quote, both sides of a story? How do you all address
that? It's a great question. I mean, obviously there are different stories and different storylines and different situations require a different approach. I think we would probably all agree that, as journalists, you try to stay open-minded to all sides of issues, but it is true that there are certain issues in which a kind of interest in an outcome cannot help but affect your reporting. I mean, for instance, here in the United States, in terms of domestic reporting, we at the New York Times have, very clearly stated that our interest is in democracy continuing in the United States of America, and when we're reporting on threats to democracy, we don't really consider the various threats that are very real to the democratic process in the United States to be sort of valid viewpoints that we have to report on as if we are agnostic about the outcome. So that whole line of reporting, and there are numerous reporters for the magazine and a whole beat that's dedicated to this topic in the newsroom of the New York Times. Who are folks who are working on this subject are very clear about the importance of reporting on it with an interest in the continuation of democracy. I think it would be interesting as well to hear from Azmat about how, in her reporting, which you all heard from and probably read when it has come out over the years, how the question of coming into these situations, knowing what you're looking for, but also keeping an open mind about how it may have occurred has been, I've seen it in so much of your work, has been part of what enables you to find the truth.
Yeah, I mean, Anna, those were beautiful sentiments, and I really appreciate your taking us on that journey with you as you confronted those ethical challenges, because they're so difficult. And, for me, in the kind of work that I do, which often is dealing with the claims of one side, it often becomes about interrogating those claims. So much of the work, yes, I do spend a lot of time. I spend a lot of time trying to get that embed in Qatar, for example. And you might think, civilians are dying. Why do that particular part of it? Why go there? Why watch what they will likely think is their version of a press, their version of putting their story out? Why would you do that? And I worked really hard to get it. I remember they kept delaying it, denying it. They made me get a like a business visa. And then they told me, you can't bring if you're going to bring a cell phone or your laptop in the country, you have to give us the IP address. They wanted a lot of information, and I told them, I won't be bringing a laptop or a cell phone. And they said, will you sign a statement to that effect? And I said, yes. And the same day that I landed in Doha, so did my little sister, who came with a lot of equipment, and she had a lovely stay at the Ritz-Carlton in Doha while I did my reporting. But I wanted to really interrogate those claims, and I told them, I love that. I told them, they said, we have nothing to show you about civilian casualties. I said, that's fine, show me your process. Open up your process. Take me through what you do, what you claim to do. And yes, I worked that into the story, but a few things happened from that. When I sent them the coordinates, they said, no, we won't check them for you. We can check 4. And we went back and forth, and I was told, who do you think you are trying to give us ultimatums? I had said, if you're not going to check more than 4 coordinates, I will report that. And they were livid. And then later on, I learned that the reason why they ultimately checked all 103 was because somebody whom I interviewed at that airbase liked the questions I asked and liked that I cared to hear this, and they made that happen. And yes, I worked it into the story, and I end with this very senior general essentially saying, look, we look at things from the air, you look at things from the ground, you need a combination of both. And then it precedes a section that does both, and it winds up interrogating that. And I don't say this to say there's a way around, because what Anna's describing is so specific and so unique and so insurmountable, but how I've had to deal with it is, I work that in, and what I really care about is not having false equivalence. So when you read these stories, the voices of survivors, their faces, they are everywhere. Their stories are everywhere in these stories. And it's why, there are photographers who are involved. It's why that, we go to great lengths to, poor Jake had to, I think at the very end we were crashing, and I think you actually yourself edited our final versions of a lot of these narratives that we put throughout this long story, because he cared so much about making sure that as many of these people came through. But it's about, and so yes, you'll hear from the other side, you'll hear their stories, but it's not the same. It's not the same because the harm is not the same. They are not given equal weight. You interrogate, and you report out, and you deliver what you have found your interrogation of those claims to be.
I just want to say, Anna, I also went to the Javari Valley, to the River Itakoi, about 6 months ago to try to see the place where Dom and Bruno were. I made a map at the Funai base, and I visited. While I was making the map, it's interesting the things that emerge when you just are present in the field. But I use a drone to make the map. It takes an hour or two. Usually the drone doesn't work for at least 45 minutes. But while I was doing that, I noticed on the tree beside the bank of the river, this is opposite the Funai base where Bruno would have visited many times. And there was graffiti in the tree, some names, and underneath it said FDN, Familia do Norte, which is a notorious drug cartel. This is right beside the Funai base, where presumably these illegal fishermen would have illegally passed into indigenous territory. So, and that's really what I was looking for, was for those details. And Itakoi River is like a profoundly banal river to go up. But at the same time, it's uncannily terrifying, this sense of the uncanny there. And I stopped at the house of this man who murdered them, and it was empty beer bottles on the veranda. It's just this Marie Celeste quality to the whole place. But in my work in northern Amazon, I was blessed in a way by the pandemic because the obvious film would have been, if you're going to document the crimes that are happening there, is to go and work with the indigenous communities who are their guardians, the forest guardians, who are on the front line. But because of the pandemic, indigenous people are genetically more vulnerable to respiratory diseases for various reasons. So they were we couldn't access those communities at all, and it's simply just not a conversation to be had. So as a result, I tasked myself with making this film about deforestation. I had to simply travel the Trans-Amazonian Highway and meet these environmental criminals in their territory. And this is, in some cases, quite a lawless place. And instead of, showing up looking like an NGO worker, we decided to show up like looking like a small group of guys and meet them in the cachaça bars and befriend them. And one of the biggest tools we had for our security, first and foremost, but for our storytelling was machismo, which is to appeal to the machismo of the guy who owns the illegal gold mining pit, and make sure all his subordinate workers are in front of him, show him respect, puff him up a bit, and then ask him, so can I come tomorrow and document your processes? And he cannot say no, because to say no is to show weakness. And then you have witnesses, and you show up in the next morning, and everyone's delighted. And it's like in a way, that was one of the ways we chose to find access. And otherwise, these illegal gold mining towns are like Wild West towns. It's very hard to infiltrate. And as a result, though, of those approaches, and there were other horses for other courses in terms of the illegal loggers, the burners, etc. You start to get close to these guys, and you realize they're humans, just like yourself and myself. And, all of us also are destroying the environment. But we're also good people. So there's this ambivalence, this ambiguity to the narrative that it's very easy to make a film that's black and white where we're wagging our finger and indict these people who are doing it, but actually they are people with very little opportunities. They have families to feed. They have to go back home and put bread on the table. In fact, if there's anyone who has real responsibility, it's us consumers in wealthy nations who are buying these products. And it's not just the beef burgers and Burger King, it's the leather in our SUVs that comes from the cows. It's the soybeans in our Walmart products. So I suppose I wanted to imbue all of my film, which took 4 years to make, with both sides, the 50 Shades of Grey or whatever we call it, this ambiguity. Maybe that's a bad reference. I better stop there.
What kind of photos do you take? I just want to say that, and my own government is not trying to kill me. So what you're describing is just, it's on another level. And I just want to say I have so much respect for what you do and the ethical challenges that you consider. I'm embarrassed I even answered that question given the constraints that you face.
Thank you, thank you. And thank you. I just wanted to comment that, machismo is also a tool for me. When someone is not giving me an answer I want, a man in these conditions, in these environments, I ask, what are you afraid of? I'm afraid of nothing. And things start to be. And, but I don't agree so much with the idea of, blaming the consumers. I agree with all the ambiguities, especially with the people like, for instance, this fisherman who killed Dom, He was one of those who needed to put bread on the table, but he has already turned to the other side. So how can you tell? It's very hard. And Don used to also be an advocate of the different shades and and be respectful of the people who are fighting for their own life on the ground. These are not the culprits, and I completely agree with that. But what we do in Repórter Brasil is that we try to track the money. So we point fingers at the companies, at the guys who are making the big bucks out of all these crimes. So we've tracked, for instance, in the meat industry, we've done like twice a year reports on how JBS, the largest meat producer, the largest world meat producer, supplies from illegal deforested areas and, cattle raised with labor work. And we've had some impact when we are talking about the large companies. Then you can actually have some change, especially when we get the word out from Brazil. So, I'm always trying to do partnerships, and I'm super open to partnerships with these great people here, because, for instance, if we publish a story about JBS in Brazil, we go as far as having them cut one farm from their supplier list, which is nothing. They have thousands of farms supplying them. But when we managed to publish it with The Guardian, we had 4 of the major grocery chains in the UK questioning JBS and demanding an audit of their supply chain. One of them, which was Waitrose, actually took all their products out of their shelves and restricted their trucks from coming inside. So depending on how broad you get the information, you actually have change. And I believe in consumer behavior change. I do think this is important, and we have an important role to play at this. But real change, I think, is going to come from companies' accountability.
I think that's one of the things that we're so excited about with the new support from Norway, that this whole strand of reporting on transparency, illicit and legal financial flows, commodity supply chains. I think there's a huge amount of opportunity, and it's an area where the fact that we are working in all the rainforest regions and throughout on oceans projects now as well, that we're able to draw on this community of journalists who are truly global. That they're some of the best journalists in Southeast Asia and Amazon, United States, Europe, Africa, and start connecting those dots. And I think that we can have real impact by doing that. Now, I know I promised we'd have time, but we've gotten to the end almost of our time, but are there any last burning questions from the room here? We've covered a lot of ground. If not, I want to thank all of you for being. I want to thank the panelists. You did a great job. There's so many insights that you shared. I want to thank all of you for the work that everyone in this room does, and thank you for your interest in the work that we do. So, have a good day. Enjoy the rest of this Climate Week in New York.